I would expect Germany to take steps ahead. I don't know if they will put boots on the ground in Ukraine. This will remain sensitive in view of history and Nazi Germany's role in the Second World War.
Europe is ready to rearm. That's the message from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen as she announced a plan to unleash up to 800 billion euros in defence spending. So how far could this go towards reducing or eliminating Europe's dependence on the United States? To find out, I'm joined by Katarina Engberg, a defence analyst who previously served as a Swedish representative to NATO. Katarina, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Ursula von der Leyen has previously said that the role of the Europeans in the world for the next 50 years is likely to be defined by the choices made during the next 5. Where would you place the Commission's defence spending plan in that context?
Well, it's speeding up the pace. It's no longer 5 years, but 5 months maybe, in which the Europeans have to make up for a reduced American commitment, not only to Ukraine security, but also to European security. Much of the latter was coming already. You could see the build-up of rapid deployment forces of NATO, in which the Europeans would make up 70 to 80%. So you already had sort of you were going towards a Europeanized NATO, but all these forces are now in flux and driving the Europeans to think about shouldering decisively a much larger burden for their own defense than they thought only half a year ago, I think.
Now, this plan outlines 5 mechanisms that will enable EU countries to boost their defence spending, ranging from loosening debt rules to boosting lending from the European Investment Bank, for example. From an economic perspective, how bold of a move is this?
It is a very bold move. It is Ursula von der Leyen, in her press conference yesterday, said that this could unleash 800 billion euros in defense spending over a couple of years, of course. The most important part and the major part is the relaxation of the rules of the Growth and Stability Pact. Ursula von der Leyen pointed to 650 billion euros that could be released for the use of defense spending. This, of course, if used properly by member states, could definitely boost defense spending across Europe. And then there is the special fund of 150 billion euros, which is directed towards allowing member states who have less of fiscal space and less of financial muscles to loan against the budget of the European Union, that is on very favorable conditions in order to spend on defense equipment. However, that latter fund is a precondition on a more sort of structured procedure than the relaxation of the Growth and Stability Pact. This would be spending pan-European capabilities, as Ursula von der Leyen said, and she was indicating the specific systems, drones, missiles, etc., things that the Europeans are in need of for their air defense, for their artillery, etc., where the Europeans currently lack capabilities. This spending together, as she said, aggregated demand and joint procurement would mean also that the Commission would step ahead, step in and take a much larger role, more important role in directing these, the way these funds are used. So they are 2 different sort of animals, if I put it that way.
Yeah, it seems like the attempt here is to address the issue from a number of different angles and to use various mechanisms. I would just like to contextualize the number of 800 billion euros, though. It's around $843 billion. It sounds huge, but it's still less than what the United States spent on defense in the year 2023 alone. Would this really enable Europe to reduce its dependence on America in any kind of meaningful way?
Yeah, I think it will. We should keep in mind that the American defense budget is the size of it is is molded on the global role that the US assumes that it has. The Europeans do not have that sort of ambition. They are more regionally focused. So we shouldn't compare with the total spending of the Americans. If that sort of increase in defense spending that Ursula von der Leyen now foresees, she says that member states could increase defense spending in the order of 1.5% of their GDP on defense. If that is directed toward regional needs, it would make a huge difference. But again, it also requires that this money is spent wisely. So actually Europeans acquire the sort of capabilities that are needed to make up for potential reduced American engagement in Europe.
How would you advise member states to use that money wisely?
Well, I think we are now heading towards more of a structured sort of procurement within the European Union. There has been some resistance to that from my country, for example, or reluctance, I would put it that way. But you cannot sort of order these sort of, make this sort of joint procurement if you don't bundle together the demands and procure things jointly. This follows very much the pattern that was set during COVID, when the members of the European Union acquiesced to the role of the Commission in procuring jointly vaccines, because if we were competing in the market, things would be much more expensive, and it would be very efficient. So I think this is a path toward more efficiency in regard to defense capabilities. But still, we are just talking about important enough air defense, but these amounts still do not cover the eventuality of Europeans having to make up for US so-called strategic enablers that cover European defense currently, systems that Europeans simply don't have, because it has always been assumed that the Americans would have them, such as strategic airlift, air-to-air refueling, intelligence systems, etc. That investing and acquiring that sort of capabilities would take much larger sums and would take longer time. But I think the Europeans, in the end, may moving in that direction too.
Yeah, I did want to ask you directly about that, because given that the United States has now paused its military aid to Ukraine, to what extent would these proposals enable Europe to plug the gap, and on what timescale?
Well, Ursula von der Leyen, she underlines the possibility of using these funds for paying for weapons to Ukraine. It was with this proposal, the European Commission had to omit a proposal of adding 20 billion euros for defense equipment to Ukraine, because the Hungarians and the Slovaks opposed to this idea. So that had to be put aside for the time being. However, I think that will be solved as well. But she underlined that these proposals would enable member states also to procure and pay for equipment that can then be sent to Ukraine. Also, I think that there's a looming, with regard to support for Ukraine, I think there's a looming question now that Europeans may decide to use the frozen Russian assets of 190 billion euros sitting in Belgian and Luxembourgian banks as platforms for support to Ukraine. So the Ukraine issue was not solved at this time, but it will be solved in my mind.
What logistically would have to happen to enable the EU to access these frozen Russian funds to aid Ukraine?
Well, it will take a decision by the Europeans, and they have been reluctant for obvious reasons. I mean, these funds are they are placed in euros, and if you remove, if you break rules basically on how the financial system and banking system operates, so it has to do with legal constraints, but also the stability of the euro. So you start messing with those frozen assets, you introduce an element of risk. But I think Europeans may come to the conclusion that that risk is smaller than letting Ukraine flounder. I don't think Ukraine will flounder, but still, if the Americans do not unblock the embargo imposed currently on military deliveries to Ukraine, they will run out of specific elements of their armament in like half a year or so. And in particular, it's particularly serious with regard to the Patriot missiles, of course. Now, it's the Americans that produce the Patriot missiles, and there's no abundance of those missiles, not even in the United States. So even with money, acquiring those Patriots will require also some planning. We have seen previously European countries providing Ukraine with their own Patriot system. I think Germany has done that, and then they have bought new on their own. And there is, as you may know, a plan you have already started in Germany to build a factory that at the end of 2027 will produce massive numbers of Patriots. So the Europeans are getting there, but this is not something that is you can easily produce within a couple of months. This takes years, but you see the ambition, you see the European ambition.
The prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, even in the case of a peace deal, appears very remote right now. With this boost in spending, would the EU and the UK together be able to provide security guarantees to the country? And do they have the will to do so?
I think you will hear the European to continuously saying that they need some American backing if they are going to put boots on the ground and planes in the air, as the French and the British have been talking also about fighter aircrafts. But we do not know if the American will produce that sort of backing, and what sort of backing, intelligence, transport, or maybe nothing. The American President Trump has said that they will not do much in terms of backing of a European capability. This is very much up to the Europeans, the American president continues saying. And in the end, the Americans may not provide solid security backing of a European force. So where does that leave the Europeans? That would probably also leave the Ukrainians without any security guarantees from the Americans. So it will all be up to the Europeans. And in that case, I guess that Ukrainians will continue fighting, and the Europeans will be left with the option between backing down, cutting their losses, or stepping in. This is an alternative between a bad and a worse alternative. This is a choice between a bad and worse alternative. But I think even with lack of American backup and security guarantees, American security guarantees for the Ukrainians, the Europeans will have to step in one way or the other, because if they leave the Ukrainians not on their own, but still without a weakened commitment, Western weakened commitment, you will just see the Russian appetite for moving forward increase. And that would spell dangers not only for Ukraine's security, but for European security in the long run. So in the end, I think Europeans will, in case we will end up with a lack of American engagement, the Europeans will step in one way or the other.
You mentioned the British and the French talking about planes in the air and boots on the ground. I want to look specifically at Germany now. It has a leadership vacuum after current Chancellor Olaf Scholz was defeated in last month's election. And that was really apparent at the summit in London over the weekend when the UK and France announced they were working on a ceasefire plan for Ukraine that they wanted to present to the United States. When you consider the future of European defence, who do you look to as steering the way?
I think we are looking at Germany. I think I would expect Germany to take steps ahead. I don't know if they will put boots on the ground in Ukraine. This will remain sensitive in view of history and Nazi Germany's role in the Second World War. So Germany may choose another way of supporting a European force, and I cannot at this point imagine what that would look like. But I would expect Germany to step forward. We have seems to have a determined leadership in Germany currently in this regard. So I will follow developments in Germany with great interest.
When you talk about this determined leadership, are you talking about the next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz?
Yes. It seems that the European issues, this deteriorating security situation with doubts about the American engagement only surfaced at the end of the electoral campaign. So what you see is a sort of German politicians defining their position in accordance to these recent changes. So I guess this could have happened with the current or the outgoing government as well. But you definitely see a very fore-leaning position by the future Chancellor Merz. And you have now, just as of yesterday, I think, had an agreement across between SPD, CDU and the Greens on not only putting 500 billion euros into a fund for infrastructure, but also removing the debt brake on defense expenditure over 1% of German GDP. I found that very creative and interesting. So we see a new government moving in after Easter, we hope. You see a determination on the German side across the board, if you accept, of course, ADF and Die Linke, in terms of increasing now drastically defense spending in Germany. And I found that removal of the debt brake on specifically on defense very creative. As I have understood it, there wasn't time to get the 2/3 majority in the current Bundestag for lifting the debt brake. And it would have been would not been possible with the next Bundestag. But however, one managed to find a way whereby defense expenditure specifically was removed from the limitations of the debt brake. I don't know how this technically and legally is being thought through, but I just noticed the news.
That's what I was going to ask you. When you say creative and interesting, whether you mean legally fuzzy and whether you think we need to embrace some of this fuzziness in order to make progress on this topic.
I think generally Europeans have to overcome some of their hesitations and become more creative. As with discussing the possibility of using the frozen Russian assets, you have to weigh the risk of the legal and financial stability risks of seizing these funds against the risk of not using these funds in order to support to Ukraine. So, as in politics in general, these are relative decisions. It's very seldom between the 100% good and 100% bad. These are trade-offs, but of course they are particularly dramatic at this point in time.
Yes, definitely legal grey areas to be worked out there. Now, here in Germany, there's talk about reintroducing conscription. Based on your knowledge of the current defence situation, is this something that European countries would generally be advised to do? And if so, do you sense there'd be public support for such a move?
I think it will be necessary. I think because, unfortunately, the Ukrainian war demonstrates, should we ever, God forbid, our own countries be aggressed, that you have to count on attrition rates. That's a cold way of putting that a lot of lives will be spent. And you have to have deep pockets of reserves, humans that can be put into the front line as soldiers are being killed and maimed. That's war, unfortunately. Just professional armies will not be enough in order to plan for war as we've seen it develop in Ukraine. The thoughts at the end of the Cold War, the thoughts of expeditionary forces based on professional soldiers, more limited, but for expeditionary forces, that doesn't work anymore. You have to go back to more of the planning we had during the Cold War, and as the Ukraine war has illustrated, there are elements of how war was fought in the First World War and the Second World War. So that require much more of many more soldiers, particularly in terms of reserves. that can fill up the gaps. And then you have to draw on your population. With regard to my own country, I guess the preparedness for doing that varies greatly within Europe. We used to have a conscript system, so we are now going back to that. So that's natural for Swedes, although it's a frightening experience for young people that they can be mobilized and sent to front lines, NATO front lines across on the other side of the Baltic. But still, the defense will is high in Sweden. So I think the young population is gradually adjusting to this new reality. And also, as a matter of fact, since, again, mobilizing a conscript army or conscript system requires vast personal resources, also in terms of officers that educate the conscripts. That takes a lot of time, and there are limitations on professional soldiers that can educate conscripts. So the constraints limit the amount currently of individuals that are being mobilized for conscripts in Sweden. We hope to move to 8,000 a year. That's not much. We used to draw during the Cold War on the pool of 100,000 or 120 young people in that cohort that would be eligible for conscript. So it will take time, which also means that a lot of young people are not affected. But as we previously used in conscripting people or mobilizing young people for the conscript system, coincided more or less with the young people who wanted to be mobilized to become conscripts. Now, with the new situation and the wish to enlarge the pool of conscript, you will call the government or the state will call up young people who have refused to do the conscript systems, and there will be penalties if you don't abide. So there will be a more forceful sort of element that young people are not used to. So this is my country, and I cannot speak on behalf of Spaniards or Portuguese, though I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, it's not that I'm disdainful about Southern European countries, but I guess they don't have the same experience as Northern and Northeastern European countries have with being close to the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Let's talk a little bit about that question of European consensus then, because these plans, they are still only proposals, aren't they? Do they require unanimous backing from all the member states? And if so, what are the chances that a country like Hungary may choose to veto them?
Yeah, that's a good question. They opposed the proposal for the 20 billion euros package for Ukraine, but so far we haven't seen any opposition to the package. But positions will be defined over the next couple of days.
Sure. Now, as a final question for you, you've written extensively about the concept of a common European defence union. Based on what you're seeing right now, would you say we're on that path? And what would such a union really mean in concrete terms?
Yes, I think we are moving towards what I call a total European defence union. And with that, I mean, I allude to the concept of total defense that was applied by Sweden and Finland during the Cold War and continues to be applied again now by the two countries, by which we think that the whole of society will be affected by war. So we shall now look forward to the Commission putting forward two strategies at the end of March, one the 19th on the future of European defence, and we see now some of that being decided already tomorrow by the European Council. So one has there's a speed, there's another sense of urgency. So, but on the 19th there will be this full strategy on the future of European defence, which is more militarily. But on the 26th, you will have the strategy on preparedness based on the proposal and the report written by the former Finnish President Niinistö, which is very much a broad description of how you have to mobilize all of a society's resources for war, not only the military, but the civilian as well. This is based on our experience. We always thought that would we be affected by war, civilian population had to be mobilized and protected. And this, of course, is an experience and observations that have been reinforced by the way we see how the war in Ukraine is conducted by the Russians, aiming specifically at civilian population and civilian infrastructure. So by putting forward these two different strategies, the one on the future European defense and the one on preparedness during the latter part of March, I see, with my Swedish eye, I see the concept of total defense being applied by the European Union. It doesn't mean it's total. It doesn't hang together. But we have islands and atolls of elements of this total defense concept emerging, and an attempt that's bridging the gaps between them. However, this is very complicated. Even for my country, trying to mobilize civilian preparedness, take preparedness of a lot of actors in society. It's not easily done. And then doing this on the European level, we take a lot of time. But I think there's an urge and an understanding of the need to move not only on the military, but also on the civilian side, and to combine them in a civil-military approach to defense. So while this is not the formal goal of the European Union to create any total defense, I see the pattern emerging. Incomplete, incoherent, but still moving with a lot of dynamic now.
We're certainly seeing an urgency that has never been there before. Katarina Engberg, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.